this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I am back with another YouTube video for you. This is a watercolor tutorial, and it will be a landscape painting, and the reference photo for it will be a picture that I took in Yellowstone National Park, and I thought that would be a really fun painting to do with you. So if you would like to have a better copy of the reference photo, please head over to my blog and I will have it there available for you to use as a guide as you're painting along. Tools you will need today is some watercolor paper. I'm using a Strathmoore 400 watercolor sketchbook in this video, but you can use whatever you have. Just make do. It's okay. You'll need watercolor paints. I'm using my M. Graham paints, but you can use whatever watercolor paints you have and just make do with them. It's totally fine. Other tools, you'll need water for your paint. You'll need tape if you need to tape your paper down. Other things, I have Fineline masking fluid. This helps protect the white of the paper. It's kind of like rubber cement, but it comes off. I use this for the grass. If you don't have it, you can just draw your individual strokes of grass that way. So there's that. And then other things you'll need is some paintbrushes. Just use the paintbrushes you have and learn how to use them well. I use a variety, but mostly you'll just need a couple round paintbrushes like this number 12 round paintbrush and this number 2. You'll want something with a fine tip. The bigger paintbrushes are mostly just to help wet in the paper quicker or lay down more color more quickly. Other things that are optional is I have a squirt bottle to wet my paints more quickly instead of dipping water into each of them. And I also use a heat tool when I'm working because that helps dry the paper more quickly. And let's get into it. To start off, I'm going to be taping a border around the edge of my paper. The paper I flipped back was a protective page that divides each watercolor paper in the Strathmoore 400 sketchbook. After I tape around each edge, I'm going to use gator clips to hold down the edges of my paper so they don't slip and slide while I'm painting. If your paper is loose and not attached to a journal or something, you'll want to tape it down to a board or a piece of cardboard to keep it from warping while working. The next thing I do is get my paints ready to go, so I'm ready to paint as soon as my drawing's done. See me coming in with a mechanical pencil. I really like sketching with mechanical pencils because they're such a fine line and they erase really easily. And I'm just blocking in the basic mountain shapes of my reference photo. The nice thing with landscapes is that you don't have to follow exactly what the picture says. So it's a great way to start drawing when you aren't 100% confident with your drawing skills, because you're not trying to create anatomy or anything like that. You're just doing basic lines and then you can fill them in with paint as you go along. Now, aside from doing the lines for the mountains, I'm also doing a few vertical lines to indicate where the trees are going to be. That way I can keep track of it visually. And I'm also drawing some logs in the foreground so that I can protect those areas as I'm working and they don't get completely covered in green. Now I'm filling in the top of the paper with some clean, clear water, and I am getting it all wet so I can do soft blends of blues in the sky. Now, one thing to pay attention to is that I am not putting water anywhere on the paper that I do not want blue from the sky to get into. I did put a little bit of water on the furthest mountain so that it can have a soft edge with the sky, but I didn't put out any water on the foreground because I don't want any blue touching that area. One way to keep control of your watercolor painting is to only wet the areas that you want paint to flow to. Adding wet paint to wet paper in watercolor is called wet into wet, and this technique results in really soft blends of the paint. You can see the paint I'm adding is really soft and it's flowing out and it's creating really soft edges. Now, Strathmoore 400 paper tends to dry more quickly than Arches paper, so I just sprayed a little bit of water on my paper to help keep the paint flowing. You can see the paint I'm adding to the top of the paper is darker than the paint I'm adding to the bottom of the sky area. That is because when we look at the sky, it is darker towards the top, and then it comes down and it lightens. So when you are painting a sky to help create depth and distance in your painting, make sure you keep the top of your sky a little bit darker than what is closest to the ground. Once the sky had dried, I started adding water to the distant mountain area so I could do a wet into wet wash on that. This mountain is further away, so it's going to appear more blue visually. It's not going to have as sharp of edges and details as the ones in the foreground, and it's going to have a more gray tint to it. So I'm trying to keep the colors soft and blended so it doesn't have too sharp of lines, and it's going to have softer colors. I'm doing dab motions up and down, and that is to help create the impression of it being a forested mountain. I then took a rag that was dry and dabbed up some of the paint towards the base of the mountain. This is to help give the impression of there being fog settled in that area of the mountain range. And now I'm coming back in with some darker paints and just dabbing some more. It's kind of a back and forth process when painting with watercolor. You lay some down, you soften the edges, you blend it, and then you lay some more. So just take your time with painting and learn to enjoy the process of this back and forth dance between you and your paints. Now, once that distant mountain had dried, it was time to work on the mountain in front of it. You can see I'm coming in with slightly more vibrant greens. That's because it is closer to us, so you're going to see more of the green hue. There's going to be slightly less blue to the trees and the mountains. It's the same process that I did in the distance. It's just slightly more opaque towards the bottom since there isn't the fog that has settled down in front of that hill. So just back and forth dabbing. I did a mix of colors. There's some sap green, there's some hooker's green in there, and I've added a little bit of the gray blue that I used in the distance. I'm coming in on the other side and just adding a little bit of green to the edge of it, but I'm not going to paint in the whole thing just yet because I am going to be adding a wash of brown to it and a little bit. So I'm just adding the green to the very edge, and then I'll work on it later. While the little rim of green is drying, I'm going to start working on the foreground. This is going to be the base color for the grass, and so I'm using a lot of yellows, yellowy greens, and some oranges. I believe I used a mix of azo green, cad yellow, and cad orange to create the soft washes. You can see that I am doing more horizontal brush strokes than I was doing while painting the mountains. This is because I want the texture of the grass to look different than the texture of the mountains. So I'm doing more horizontal strokes, and they're bigger strokes for now, and then we will gradually build up the texture of the grass as we go along. Now I'm coming in with a clean dry paintbrush, and I'm just dabbing it over the wet paint. This is helping to soften the edges of the paint I've laid down without getting rid of all of the texture that I've built up. Now I'm coming in with a clean wet paintbrush, and I am just scrubbing that distant mountain and some of the sky to reinforce the impression that there is fog. It got a little too dark, and so scrubbing the paper with a clean wet paintbrush and then dabbing it away with a rag will help to lift some of the paints you have used, and it will bring back the white of your paper. Now I'm coming in with a light brown paint, and I am just adding that to the mountain that we hadn't finished coloring in or painting in yet. On this mountain in the reference photo, there's a lot of rocks peeking through, and so I'm starting to add the brown as the base color to give the impression of rock and dirt peeking through in between the trees. While that paint is still wet, I'm starting to dab in little bits of green paint to help give the impression of trees and grass and bushes that are also on the mountain. And as I go along, the water on the paper will dry, and I'll start to get sharper edges. The sharper edges, or the harder lines of the paint that I'm laying down, makes the trees and bushes that I'm painting come forward more visually and make this mountain look like it's in front of the other ones. Now I'm just adding green to the base of the mountain to help darken that area up before I paint the grove of trees that comes in front of it. Now throughout the video, you'll see my hand rub across my painting. That's just me double checking to make sure my paper is completely dry and it's not cool to the touch. With me adding the pine trees in this area, I don't want the paint I'm adding to blend out at all. I want to keep nice crisp details. So I'm just adding vertical straight lines and then doing little horizontal brush strokes next to it to give the impression of branches. With it still being fairly distant, I don't need to have super accurate detail, I just need to give the impression of pine trees in the distance. Now the paint I'm using to paint these distant pine trees is slightly darker than what I use to paint the mountains behind it. This helps create contrast and helps the pine trees to stand out visually. I'm also varying how high the pine trees are and where they start on the horizon line so that they give the impression of some being further back and some being older and taller and not having it be a straight line across. Straight lines rarely happen in nature, and so we want to have it vary a little bit as we go along. Now I'm just adding layers and layers and layers of trees, just repeating the same process over and over and over again to create the impression of a forest. With the trees that are coming more forward and towards the later layers, I am darkening up the paints just a bit to help them stand out. Once I am satisfied with the trees for now, I'm going to come in and start working on the grass again. Mainly focusing on the grass that's directly underneath the trees we just painted. I'm just trying to create some shadow and darkness underneath those trees that will help make the trees look like they actually belong to the landscape we're painting. I'm just blending it out softly and varying up the colors I'm using, so some dark greens, some blue greens, some yellowy greens. They're becoming lighter as they come forward or towards the bottom of the paper. And then I'm adding some more trees to the background. Sometimes taking a step back from your work helps you realize what needs to be tweaked. While we're painting, you don't always see what needs to be tweaked or what's not standing out, but taking a step away from things helps you realize where things need to be adjusted. As we're painting these trees and we're having the trees appear closer to us visually, we are going to want to make those trees slightly larger as they come down the paper or towards the bottom of the paper. That's because when we're looking at a landscape, things that are closer to us are larger and things that are more distant from us are smaller. And so doing that in our painting will help keep that perspective, in addition to using color theory like making things that are farther away more gray and blue, and the things that are closer to us more saturated and having sharper details. Now I'm coming in and working on the grassy foreground area, and so I'm starting to add some shadows and shading to where the logs and the trees that I'm going to put in the foreground will be. I'm still keeping my brush strokes fairly horizontal because I want them to stand out from the vertical strokes of the pine trees. Now that the layer that we just did on the grass is dry, I'm going to come in and start blocking in some of the logs that I drew on the foreground. I'm just using a light brown, and then with that paint still being wet, towards the base of the log, I'm doing a stroke of darker brown paint and letting that blend up. That will help create a shadow effect to the logs. Now that the paper is dry, I'm going to come in with my pencil and just roughly sketch in where I want the trees in the foreground to be before I commit them to paint. Now I'm coming in with a very fine point paintbrush and I'm starting to block in the trunks of the tree This paintbrush is called a Dagger paintbrush, and it's cut at an angle and has a very fine tip to it, and it's excellent for getting very fine lines, especially ones that you want to have more organic shapes. And it's great for getting like small details like the branches of a tree, because they all kind of wobble and they are slightly different, which you want when painting something in nature. Now I'm coming in and very carefully adding kind of the impression of branches and pine needles to my trees in the foreground. And I'm also using a fairly dark green color for them so that they stand out from the background. And I'm just going to repeat the process I did with the last tree to all the trees in this foreground area so that they appear more visually close because you're seeing more detail, and to create a difference between these trees and the ones in the distance. And just as you go along painting these trees in this area, make sure that the trees appear more thick and dense towards the bottom versus the top. Trees are usually more sparse, there's less competition with other trees towards the top. So you want more individual branches to show up at the tops of the trees versus towards the bottom. Now I'm just repeating the process with the other trees in the foreground, adding brown for the trunks of the trees, and then carefully adding in the foliage around them. Once my trees are dry, I come in with a slightly stronger yellowy green color to add some more saturation to to the grass area, and then I let it dry and I start adding my Fineline masking fluid. Masking fluid is like a rubbery type substance that you kind of squirt on your paper where you want to protect your highlights, and then you can go back through and add your dark washes over the top, and it won't penetrate the areas where the masking fluid has protected. So I'm just going over and adding kind of grass-like texture wherever I want highlighted grass to be, making sure that the grass in the distance has smaller strokes to it and the grass in the foreground is slightly longer, again to help give that visual distance. You'll want to make sure that your masking fluid is completely dry on your paper before you come in with more paint. If not, your paintbrushes might pick up some of the masking fluid and it will get stuck in your bristles and potentially ruin your paintbrush, which we don't want to do. But you can see I'm starting to come in with some dark shadows for under the trees to help give weight and substance to the trees so they don't look like they're just floating in a field of green. And I'm just going to keep doing that under all of the trees. Once I have the basic shadows underneath all the trees, it's time to go in and start adding some more texture to the grass and dimension. So I'm taking different shades of green. I'm still keeping them pretty light and layering them in different areas of the grass. My strokes are now becoming more vertical and just varying in shape and motion to help create movement of the grass. You'll see as I am working on this grass more and more, I start to pull in some other colors into the grass, like oranges, not just light greens and dark greens, but I have oranges and yellows and blues and purples in the shadow areas. This helps create interest and texture in our painting, and it helps make it more visually appealing. Sometimes if we try to stick with just one color, it can make things look flat and it can make it look almost boring. So I like to add little splashes of unique colors there to help create a livelihood to the painting. In between several layers of paint, I'll let it dry and I'll add some more Fineline masking fluid to it to help create variations in what the grass looks like. So I'll do some dark washes, let it dry, put some masking fluid down, and then paint some more washes of color over the top and keep layering that way. That way our grass gets a lot of texture and dimension. Now I'm going to come in and start adding some other types of foliage to the grassy areas. So some bushes and shrubs that are growing in the fields. Some of them are going to be under the trees. This is going to help make it look more realistic and add some shadow and dimension. Others I'm going to be using to help draw the eye to different areas of the painting. You can see there's just those two little bushes that are like right in line with each other. I'm coming in and adding some smaller ones that kind of go off in a distance. That way those two bushes aren't competing since they were on the same level. Now I'm going in and just reinforcing some of the trees and adding more detail and shading to them. You'll also see me go in with some different shades of green and start doing some vertical strokes at the bottom of the paper. This is to help give the impression of grass being close up, as we can see the individual strokes of grass. This will also provide some more shading to the grass that is highlighted, or not highlighted, protected by the masking fluid that will be highlighted once it's removed. And you can see I'm going in with some more masking fluid to protect more areas, and then I'll do some more washes of color over the top of those. Now with a clean rag over my finger, I am gently rubbing the paper in small circles. This is to help rub off the masking fluid we've laid down. I wouldn't suggest using your plain finger over it because that will potentially smear the paint that is sitting on top of the masking fluid. I'm gently rubbing my hand over to make sure I've gotten all the masking fluid off. And there we have it, the finished painting. I hope you enjoyed following along on this tutorial, and if you did, please hit the like button, and if you want to be notified more of future videos I make, please hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you'll be informed when they're released. Have a great day!